Fantastic. We're going to get underway this evening. A very warm welcome to you wherever you're joining from. It's wonderful to see people from not only from the UK, but from across the pond. Warm welcome to our American friends. Our two panelists are also joining us from the United States of America this evening, but both of them, rather excitingly, have Cambridge connections, which we'll mention in a moment. But on behalf of Christian Heritage, it's my pleasure to welcome you. Just to let you know a little bit about tonight. Tonight is the second in our Moot Points series, where we're bringing together Christians and non-Christian thinkers to discuss important questions in our cultural moment. And I'm sure you'll agree with me, wherever you're coming from this evening, that this question of design in the universe, of purpose of design, is one which is hugely important. And has many, many implications. So without further ado, I'm going to welcome our panelists. We're really excited to be joined by Dr. Stephen Meyer, my apologies. He received his PhD in the philosophy of science from the University of Cambridge. He previously worked as a geophysicist, then as a college professor, and he now directs the Discovery Institute Center for Science and Culture in Seattle, Washington, where I'm told the weather is quite similar to the UK. So wonderful, in other words. But a warm welcome to Dr. Meyer. It's great to have you with us. And we're also hugely honored to be joined by Dr. James Croft. James is the leader of the Ethical Society of St. Louis, which is a humanist congregation in that city. He also has a Cambridge connection, having studied at Homerton College before going on to do his doctoral work in philosophy and education at Harvard. James writes widely on philosophy, science, and culture, and you can also tune into his platform addresses at the Ethical Society. Last but certainly not least, I'm going to introduce my colleague, my boss, Kevin Moss. Kevin is joining us this evening from Cardiff. It's good to have him with us, and he's going to be moderating this evening's conversation. He is a PhD candidate in intellectual history at the University of Aberystwyth, and I'm going to hand over to him now to let us know the ground rules for tonight and to kick off this conversation, which I'm sure will be hugely exciting. Over to you, Kevin.
Thanks, Josh, and warm welcome to all of you. And here's the deal for tonight. We want this to be a conversation between two different perspectives on this design issue, and it's prompted by the recent publication of Dr. Meyer's new book, Return of the God Hypothesis. So my guess is there's going to be a bit of a conversation that has a little to do with this. And the way we're going to handle this evening is that Steve will kick off with a 10 to 12 minute initial presentation, and then James will follow up with an initial response. And once that's happened, they'll be in conversation through to around 8:30. By all means, if you have questions you'd like to post, use the Q&A facility to do it. And if I can, I will filter those into the resulting discussion. But from 8:30 through to 9 o'clock, we're going to have a kind of catch up and look at some of those questions that you've posted. And we hope to finish reasonably promptly at 9 o'clock so that people can go to bed and do other things. So thank you very much. And I will invite Dr. Meyer to kick off with his opening statement. Thank you.
Right. Well, thank you to Kevin and to Josh, to the Christian Heritage staff, and to James for joining us for this discussion. The discussion is in part prompted by the publication of my new book, Return of the God Hypothesis, which is examining a question that came out of my previous two books. First book, Signature in the Cell, second book, Darwin's Doubt. We're both arguing that there is evidence of intelligent design in the origin and history of life, in particular evidence that has been discovered at the foundation of life, the presence of functional information in a digital form, which is crucial to building the first living cell and indeed crucial to building new forms of life subsequent to that. I argued in the first books that what we know from our uniform and repeated experience is that information, especially in a functional digital form, always arises from an intelligent source, whether we're talking about a computer program or a paragraph in a book or a hieroglyphic inscription or information being transmitted over a radio signal. All information of the form we find at the foundation of life has an intelligent source. And so when we examine the competing explanations for the origin of the information necessary to build, for example, the first living cell, we find that the best explanation is actually the activity of a designing intelligence. As a consequence of making that argument, which I made at much more length than I just described here, many of my readers wanted to know, well, who do you think the designing intelligence is, or what kind of attributes can we ascribe to that intelligence? In other words, what can science tell us about that ultimate question of the origin and nature of the intelligence responsible for life, if indeed there is such an intelligent agent responsible? One of the things I appreciate about the persons opposite in this debate, in particular, the new atheist writers, Richard Dawkins, Lawrence Krauss, and others, is they do a great job of framing the key issues. And Dawkins, as usual, comes in very strongly on this question of what science can tell us about this ultimate question. He says that the universe that we observe has exactly the properties we should expect if at bottom there is no purpose, no design, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. No purpose, no design, blind, pitiless indifference is shorthand for the concept of materialism or strict scientific naturalism. And what I appreciate about that statement is a beautiful framing statement for the discussion, because it says, first of all, that metaphysical hypotheses, theism, deism, pantheism, and materialism can be tested by observing the natural world and seeing if what we observe comports with what we would expect given one or the other of those hypotheses. Dawkins says that what we observe comports with the idea of no design, no purpose, and strict materialism. But the argument in my book contests that. And it says that there have been three major and very significant discoveries about biological, physical, and cosmological origins in the last century that are decidedly unexpected on a materialistic worldview. In particular, the discovery that, as best we can tell, the universe, the physical universe of matter, space, and even time, matter, space, time, and energy had a definite beginning. The second big discovery is that from the beginning, or very soon after, the basic parameters of physics were set in such a way as to make life possible, and they were set against all odds without explanation from any underlying physical theory. This is known as the fine-tuning of the universe, or the cosmological fine-tuning, or indeed the anthropic fine-tuning. And the third discovery is the one I already touched on, is that at the foundation of life, we have discovered in even the very simplest cells, information and complex information processing systems, information storage, transmission, and processing systems that are that not just rival, but clearly exceed our own in their sophistication of their design. And as I mentioned before, the presence of information is a hallmark or indicator of the activity of intelligent agency. And so I argue that those three discoveries taken together are best explained by theistic design or a theistic worldview, as opposed to competing worldviews such as the dominant worldview in the Western world, materialism, or even pantheism or deism. Now, in the book, I underscore the unexpected nature of these outcomes from the standpoint of materialism by highlighting what I call exotic naturalistic or exotic materialistic hypotheses. And there are a great number of them. And this shows, I think, these are auxiliary or ad hoc hypotheses that have been formulated by committed scientific naturalists or materialists to explain or attempt to explain these three big discoveries. And so what we're finding in the discussion now are exotic concepts like imaginary time, or super space in the universal wave function, or phantom fields, or the ever-present multiverse hypothesis, or yet even more exotic, the idea of space alien designers. And these are being proposed by naturalists to account for things that would be otherwise unexpected on basic naturalism. And what I show in the book is that that these hypotheses, I actually take these on and take them seriously and respectfully, but these hypotheses themselves either have unexpected theistic implications of their own, or they have science destroying, as a consequence of them, they have science destroying absurdities. For example, the attempt to explain the origin of information has repeatedly, in the biological context, has repeatedly resulted in hypotheses that presuppose prior unexplained information. The RNA world, for example, is a hypothesis that attempts to account for the origin of the first information and the first information processing for the original cell. But even to get a self-replicating RNA system going, you have to have prior information embedded in the RNA molecule, information that is in ribozyme experiments, simulation experiments, always provided by an intelligent agent. Similarly, the multiverse requires, has been used to explain the origin of the fine-tuning of the universe, but all universe-generating mechanisms associated with the multiverse hypotheses themselves require prior fine-tuning. And in the cosmological area, most interestingly to me, and this is one of the original or unique contributions of the book, at least I think so, and that is that the attempt to explain the origin of the universe using something called quantum cosmology has required modeling the origin of the universe mathematically, and to successfully model the origin of our universe with our physics, the mathematical modelers must input information into the mathematical apparatus. They must constrain degrees of mathematical freedom to get a universe out the backside of their model that matches our universe. And so even in that case where they're attempting to circumvent the problem of the origin of the universe, they circumvent the problem of the universe having a beginning with this quantum cosmological approach, they end up requiring or using a modeling method that implies the prior activity of a mind to generate the specificity and information that would give us a universe much like ours. So that's a general sketch of the book. It looks at these three big discoveries and asks which of the competing major worldview systems best explain them. And I argue, for reasons that I'm summarizing here, that theism provides that a best overall explanation of those big three discoveries.
Okay, thank you very much. That was very quick as an opening statement. Great. Well, on to you then. Thank you very much, James.
Well, thank you, Kevin, and everyone at Christian Heritage for being the host of tonight's discussion. I'm delighted to join you from St. Louis, Missouri, particularly because I am, as was said at the beginning, a proud graduate of the University of Cambridge. And though we're not all there together, tonight nonetheless brings back a lot of warm memories of walking past your church and looking up at the marvelous 12th century building and thinking about all the great thinkers who would have trod the same path the last 900 years. And I think that in a sense today, we're continuing a great tradition because we are here to discuss some of the biggest questions that human beings have been asking for millennia. How did we get here? Why is there a universe at all? Why is the universe as it is? And that's why I'm really delighted to join you, Dr. Meyer, for the discussion this evening, because even though we have very different religious views and metaphysical perspectives, I sense that we share a feeling of wonder at the grandeur of the cosmos and a desire to know as best we can the answer to these big questions. So in that sense, we make a good pair. And thank you, Dr. Meyer, for discussing these questions with me today.
And to you too, James. Yes, absolutely. I've always said that I feel a commonality with people who are interested in the big questions and willing to discuss them, irrespective of which side or which of the many sides they may come down on. There's a kinship, even a friendship of common interest, I think, that flows naturally from this interest, and I've always found that. So thank you for joining us. And I'm interrupting your opening statement.
No, it's okay. I was amazed by your ability to summarize a 450-page book in 8 minutes, so I'm going to try and move quickly. So Dr. Meyer defends tonight the idea that science reveals the mind of God, and I'm here to say I don't think that's the case. But to be clear, I'm not going to offer any of my own explanations regarding how the universe came about or how life arose. If I had those, I'd be collecting my Nobel Prizes this evening instead of talking with you. but rather I'm just going to simply argue that Dr. Meyer's argument, as he presents it in his book, does not give us reason to infer that a God was the cause of the phenomena he explores. And I'm going to share a few slides to explain my 3 reasons why I think that is the case. So firstly, what do I think Dr. Meyer is actually arguing? I've tried to do a version of this argument here. Hopefully it's reasonably fair. We might put it in a 3 scientific theories are unable to explain and are unlikely to explain certain observed phenomena, such as the origin of the universe, the fine-tuning of the universe, and the origin of life. All these phenomena exhibit characteristics which are also and only found in phenomena we know to be the result of intelligent agency. Therefore, these phenomena were most likely also the result of intelligent agency. Obviously, there is a lot more complicated and deep than that, but that's, I think, the main structure of it. And I'm just showing this to show you the structure of my response. So a skeptic of this argument like me could basically critique it in 2 ways. I could critique premise 1 and argue that, in fact, the science is significantly better at explaining these phenomena than Dr. Meyer suggests. And numerous scientists have done that. They suggest that consistently, Dr. Meyer underplays the success of scientific theories, perhaps has missed more recent scientific discoveries which show promising avenues towards a naturalistic explanation of the phenomena that he explores. But since I'm a philosopher and not a scientist, I'm going to focus on a different critique. I am going to allow scientists to defend science, and for the purpose of tonight's discussion, simply grant, for the sake of argument, that Dr. Meyer is correct in saying that current scientific theories cannot explain any of these phenomena. And instead, I'm going to critique the link between the phenomena he explores and his preferred explanation, God. That is the movement from the conjunction of premises 1 and 2 to the conclusion 3. What do I mean by that? Well, Dr. Meyer is making what is known as an abductive argument. That means that he's looking at various features of the natural world, various clues, as it were, and he's reasoning backward to what he thinks are plausible explanations for the existence of those clues, sort of like a detective figuring out who committed a crime from clues left behind at a crime scene. And he concludes that a really powerful transcendent agent is a good explanation of the clues that we find. And if that's what Dr. Meyer is saying, then I am saying, not so fast. Perhaps we do see these clues. Perhaps we cannot currently explain them naturalistically, but that doesn't mean it's legitimate to draw the conclusion that God did it. Because, and this is my argument in a nutshell, you don't have enough independent evidence independent of the phenomena you're trying to explain, to justify that specific conclusion. So I want to offer 3 reasons here sketched very briefly as to why I say that conclusion is unwarranted. Firstly, I want to suggest that the form of abductive reasoning to attribute the phenomena he investigates to God is highly unusual. It lacks key features of successful abductive inferences that we make every day. Most important, we have no background knowledge of the agent which is being appealed to. And to understand why this is a problem, consider a little thought experiment. Imagine I go to check in at the Ritz-Carlton and I return to my car to find the passenger side window smashed and the glove compartment open. This, by the way, is not my car. Just in case you're wondering, I'm clergy, but we can all dream, right? So I come back, the window's smashed, things are strewn about inside, and the Nintendo Switch that was hidden in the compartment is missing. Think for a second. Would it be legitimate to infer that an adult human being was the cause justified in making an abductive intelligent agency in that case? Most of you, I think, will accept that that is a secure inference. And I think that's because we have 3: existence, means, and motive. we have overwhelming evidence prior to running the inference that the agent we're appealing to, human beings in this case, actually exist. So we're not trying to justify the existence of humans. We know they exist already. That's built in. Secondly, we already know that human beings are agents with the capacity to do the things that we say they are doing in this case. Human beings can break car windows, they can open glove compartments, etc. Their causal means are already known. And finally, motive. We already know that these agents with appropriate causal powers have plausible motives to bring about the phenomena in question. And with those three pieces of background knowledge secure, we can construct a detailed causal narrative linking the proposed agent to the observed evidence. And that detailed causal narrative is, I want to suggest, the explanation of the phenomenon. So now we might ask, can Dr. Meyer provide anything like such a detailed causal narrative using his proposed God hypothesis? I don't think so. We don't have existing background knowledge about that proposed agent to secure the inference he wants to draw. God's existence is in question. That's part of what the argument is supposed to secure. We don't know much about the means God supposedly used to do this, and God's motives are obscure. So the causal inference is weak. That's my first concern. The next two are much quicker to explain. My second concern is that Dr. Meyer's argument commits the fallacy of suppressed evidence. Basically, what's meant by this is that by focusing only on three specific phenomena that he argues support the God hypothesis, he omits consideration of all the other relevant evidence which speaks against it. And that's a fallacy, because when making an inductive argument, not only must all the premises you include be true, but all relevant true premises must be included. So to go back to the crime scene analogy, Dr. Meyer is, I respectfully submit, selecting three clues which he argues points towards the suspect he has in mind, God, and then ignoring all the others which point away from it. And that's particularly important when it comes to an inference to intelligent agency by God, because God is supposed to be the ultimate cause of everything. And therefore, everything we observe is relevant to God's existence. If there are a lot of phenomena which speak against accepting the God hypothesis, then there may be enough to outweigh the considerations Dr. Meyer presents, even if they are legitimate. And finally, this is my third critique, there's a huge amount of evidence which points away from the God hypothesis, even if there's a little bit which points towards it. Now, I don't have time to explain all the different evidence that I think favors naturalism over theism, but here are some considerations that we might dig into. Dr. Meyer points to some features of biological organisms which lead him to infer design. Many other features of biological organisms look exactly like the sort of kludge that a natural process would come up with. If God created the variety of life we see, why do we observe so much evidence for any kind of evolution at all? What is the point of God establishing an evolutionary process that it has to supplement with direct intervention? Dr. Meyer argues that God has a preference for life and set up the universe with life in mind. But as far as we can tell, there is hardly any life anywhere in the universe. I don't think life should be rare on the God hypothesis, but it is. Furthermore, and finally, if we are the point of this whole cosmic enterprise, why did we take billions of years to make our entrance? The God hypothesis would have to explain that too. And the naturalist, I submit, could add a near endless list of questions of that sort, each representing a relevant piece of evidence which speaks against the God hypothesis, which Dr. Meyer's analysis omits. So for these three reasons, as a very brief sketch, a lack of background knowledge of the proposed agent, the fallacy of suppressed evidence, and the explanatory strength of naturalism, once missing evidence is included, I am not convinced by Dr. Meyer's argument. Science, in my view, does not reveal the mind of God. Okay, I'm going to stop there and turn on my video again, because hopefully not sharing will make it a little bit easier to have everything going on at once.
And I'm
There we
back,
go.
and hopefully Steve is still with us.
I am absolutely. Let me click. I was clicking off the video to make sure that James had enough
Yeah.
bandwidth to make his presentation.
Yeah, I did the same thing. Thank you, Dr. Meyer.
I was, and I did belatedly, but I was a bit concerned there because during some of James's more important points, he's turned into pure Dalek, and I was hoping that people were able to hear him clearly. So
I'm sure we can clarify as we go
yeah,
on. Maybe sharing the slides was too much.
So actually, Steve had kept quite brief, but James, you gave I thought, a very detailed and fulsome rebuttal in what you had to say. And I wonder where, Steve, you wanted to begin to pick up to talk about this.
Yeah, in several ways that might advance the discussion here. The first is the first move that James makes in critique is to take off the table as somewhat insignificant, perhaps the most important point, which is he concedes for the sake of argument, and I think would be in a difficult position to concede for to defend the case that there are good naturalistic explanations for any of the key three pieces of evidence that I've described. And insofar as I'm making an argument as an inference to the best explanation, I actually stand in no fear of contradiction or from a better naturalistic explanation for something like the origin of life, even as aggressive proponent as Professor Dawkins of the naturalistic worldview and of the evolutionary worldview concedes that, quote, no one knows from an evolutionary standpoint how the first life arose from simpler non-living chemicals. And yet we have in living cells a system for the presence of digital information and a system for processing it, which Dawkins in a tweet last week said was of such an intricate and sophisticated variety that it knocked him sideways. And he posted a little video of an animation of the DNA replication system. If you get into the details of origin of life research, it is very hard not to come away with the intuitive impression of design right away. But when you get into a deeper analysis of the problem, as I've done in my book, Signature in the Cell, which ran, alas, over 500 pages, every single attempt to explain the origin of life from a naturalistic standpoint has led back to the unexplained need to, has led back to the need to account for the origin of information. And all approaches, whether based on chance, prebiotic natural selection working on chance, or what are called self-organizational processes, have failed. And yet we do know of a cause which is sufficient to produce information. Now, James's second point had to do with something that was right in the wheelhouse of my own PhD work, which was the conditions by which we can establish an antecedent cause as an explanation for a subsequent effect. And he's absolutely right that in general, what we look for is evidence of causal existence and evidence of causal adequacy. In the case of crime scenes, we will also look at motive, but we'll set that aside for a minute. Key point I want to make is that there is a condition or a case in which causal adequacy and causal existence can be established simultaneously. And that is the logical case in which there is only one known cause for a given effect. And when there's only one known cause, if you find the effect, it not only establishes causal adequacy, adequacy is established by our knowledge of the capability of the cause, but it's also the existence of the cause is established by the effect, because if there's only one known cause for the effect, then the cause must have been antecedently present. If it's true that where there's smoke, there's fire, when you look over if you look over the hillside and see fire coming, wafting up above, you can indeed infer that there's a fire below, even if you don't have independent knowledge of of the fire being present. So the critique based on an understanding, a correct understanding of the abductive historical method, sometimes called the method of reconstructive causal analysis, is true as far as it goes, but it doesn't go far enough, because there are cases where you can make strong abductive inferences based only on the knowledge of the adequacy of a particular type of cause, if there are no other causes that have shown themselves to be adequate. So causal existence can be established with causal adequacy when you have the case of only one known cause of a given effect. And that's exactly what I argue in the case of the information that's required to produce the first life. And to reinforce that point, one of the things I do is show that the contemporary attempts to explain the origin of the information necessary to produce the first life with things like the RNA world invariably require prior unexplained information. So they end up pushing the problem back. And you have the same kind of problem in cosmology with the fine tuning. The multiverse explanation has become the go-to atheistic explanation or materialistic explanation for the origin of the fine tuning. But there is something incorrigible about the problem of fine tuning, just like the problem of information. And so in order to account for the origin of the fine tuning that's necessary to allow for a life-friendly universe, the materialists propose that there are all these other universes out there, gabillions, I like to say. And but recognizing as they do that if you just have those other universes, they don't affect materially anything in our universe if they're causally disconnected. And so, including, they don't affect the probabilities of the fine tuning associated with the origin of a life-conducive universe. So to address that problem, multiverse advocates have proposed on string theory. Sorry, my internet connection is a bit unstable. I'm going to turn off the video again. Some are based on string theory. Some are based on what's called inflationary cosmology. But in both cases, the universe generating mechanisms, even in theory, must be exquisitely finely tuned in order to plausibly generate new universes. So the problem of fine tuning becomes incorrigible. It just gets pushed back one generation and we're right back where we started. So first of all, it's not the case that we have good naturalistic explanations for the phenomena that I focus on in the book. And secondly, the kinds of phenomena that I look at have only one known explanation. Both fine-tuning and functional information, especially in a digital alphabetic form, are produced by one and only one type of cause, and that cause is intelligence. So causal existence can be established without an independent source of information about the existence of God. Now, the other thing that Professor...
do you mind, Dr. Meyer, if I dig into some of what you've just said, just so that we can keep it kind of chunked a little bit? Is that okay?
Well, if it's all right, I'd actually like to answer it in totality, because the critique was offered in a similar vein, and I did take a few notes here. That's one advantage of doing things on Skype. I bet you've done a number of these debates. The thing I always find hardest about a debate, or but whatever we're calling this, is keeping track of the other guy's points, because so many can come at once. But there was one last point, and I actually appreciate you have a depth of understanding about this abductive reasoning, because I think that's putting us into some of the key issues in the debate at the depth I'm not usually used to getting to do in some of these things. But the other thing you said that was very interesting. And then the point about the the fallacy of not addressing the totality of evidence. I would, and that's of course true in any book, even one 450 pages, you have to focus. And so what I wanted to argue, my argument was about what can science tell us about the existence of God? And I think the scientific evidence on balance points decisively in a theistic direction. Now, might there be other considerations that point against that? Of course, there might be, but I would argue that some of the things that I didn't mention in great detail, like the question of the reliability of the human mind, or the origin of our moral motions and our moral intuitions, and how they could be normative, as we all ultimately reveal them to be in the way we act. I think that there are other considerations that weigh perhaps even more favorably, or at least as favorably, to theism. And I think some of the things that you offered, for example, the absence of knowledge of life being ubiquitously distributed throughout the cosmos, that might have a slight, there might be a slight Bayesian prior in favor of naturalism on that, but the existence of life in a finely tuned universe at all, I think, is something that decidedly favors theism in a way that dwarfs that consideration, especially since there are other very, I think, to me, appealing explanations for the presumed rarity of life in the universe. And we don't know that it's completely rare, but the presumed rarity might be a consequence of divine extravagance, that he built a whole great universe to reveal his grandeur, and all for our benefit. So I don't necessarily see that the things that I would not concede that the things that I didn't address are decisive indicators against theism. And I think the problem of explaining objective morality on a, for example, Darwinian view, or the problem of explaining the reliability of the mind, which is crucial to the function of science at all, apart from theism and the belief in a benevolent designer who made our minds in such a way as to make it possible to know the universe at all, I think are additional factors for me that support theism. In fact, my conversion to theism from agnosticism was first a consequence of reflecting deeply on the problem of epistemology. And I'm very persuaded by the argument from epistemological necessity. Once had the opportunity to have a wonderful conversation with the atheist philosopher Thomas Nagel, and we were at lunch, and he asked me how I had become a Christian and why. And I explained that my conversion preceded my interest in the question of design, and I started to explain the problem, the problem of naturalistic epistemology, and the problem of explaining the reliability of the mind apart from theism. And he interrupted me and said, "Oh, no. He said, you needn't explain." He said, "There's no question that theism solves a lot of philosophical problems." And so I think there are things I didn't address, but I think the things that I didn't address could actually be added to the strength of the case for theism, not subtracted.
James.
So that's enough for now. Yeah.
Okay, great. You're right that it's a lot, and it's a lot to keep track of. So it seems to me that second piece, as to whether there is other evidence than the pieces of evidence you explore in your book that points towards or away from theism, is kind of secondary to the main question of how good is the inference you are drawing to theism based on the three major lines of evidence that you explore in the book, being the origin of the cosmos, the fine-tuning of the cosmos, and the origin of life. And you gave an argument as to why the sort of inference you are trying to employ here is legitimate. And what you said is, if I can quote roughly, was that in some considerations, you can make an abductive inference that establishes the existence of the agent alongside a causal attribution. So first point to make is, it seems to me that this is a concession that this form of abductive inference is very different from the form of abductive inference we normally make. So when we are inferring that a human being, to use some examples that you gave, made a computer program, or the Rosetta Stone, for instance, we look at that and we infer that it was created by human intelligence. We are justifying that on the basis of a huge amount of background evidence, which it seems you concede is not present in the God case. So we need a different justification for our abductive inference in this case than in the normal case. And what you offered as a different justification was what you called it the logical case, in which only one cause is known to give rise to a given effect. Now, I'm going to get a bit technical here, but that's not a logical case, right? To have a logical case, you would need to have demonstrated that in principle, a particular cause can only ever have a given effect. Then you could logically deduce from the presence of a particular cause the effect in question. You could deduce from the effect the presence of the cause, because there's a logical relationship. That's what you need, but you don't have that in this case. because you haven't demonstrated, and I don't think you claim to have demonstrated in your work, a logical relationship between the existence of what you call information or fine-tuned systems and intelligence. You haven't demonstrated that in principle, a natural process couldn't give rise to these things. You just say it's unlikely. So that's not a logical relationship. That's just a likelihood relationship.
Let me jump in here, because I'm not. I think you're just setting the bar arbitrarily high for the purposes of justifying skepticism. I think it's important to, again, emphasize that there are no plausible chemical evolutionary explanations for the origin of the information needed to build the first life. But we do know of a cause empirically. It's empirically necessary. It's not logically necessary. It's empirically necessary based on our knowledge of cause and effect. We do know of a cause which is capable, and therefore we can infer that cause as the best explanation. I'm not making a logically certain proof. I'm not attempting to do what medieval philosophers did when they tried to make arguments for the existence of God. I'm making an argument to the best explanation. And let me give you, you had a charming illustration of your point. Let me give, I'll throw one back at you. This is philosophers doing their thing, right? It's argument by example and counterexample. Imagine that you're an explorer in Antarctica, and everything we know based on our background knowledge is that there were never any intelligent agents, human or otherwise, occupying Antarctica. It's much too cold and it's too far away. And so we have no independent knowledge of the existence of an intelligent agent acting or existing on the Antarctic continent. You're an explorer, you get through an ice shield, you find a cave, you burrow in, and lo and behold, on the walls of the cave, there are things that look for all the world like hieroglyphs and corresponding pictograms. And as you study them, you realize there are correspondences between the pictograms and the hieroglyphs, and pretty soon you realize, no, this is actually a language, there's information being transmitted here. Now, even though we had no independent knowledge and therefore ability to establish a causal existence claim for an intelligent agent, human or otherwise, on the Antarctic continent, and don't believe that anything existed, any human intelligence existed before some prior date which we could specify, we now may have evidence of the existence of intelligence prior to that date in a place that previously we had no independent knowledge of intelligence. But because we know that information is, in our experience, that has only one and only one cause, we can infer the activity of an intelligent agent even if we didn't have the independent existence condition met in some other way. And so that's my point. I think it's arbitrary to say, well, you must establish that information is logically, there's a logically necessary connection between mind and information. I think you could actually move in the direction of making that argument, because what we mean by information is the ability to choose between. The root is actually interlego. The root of intelligence is choosing between. And what we mean, if we go back to Shannon information theory, is that information is imparted when one bit is elected and another is excluded. So I think there is a sense in which what we do with our minds to choose between one thing and another is constantly imparting information, and that is deeply related to the attributes of mind and no other entity. That moves in the direction of the kind of necessity argument you're talking about. But I think to set that as the bar is arbitrary and unnecessary, because we have an empirical relationship between mind and information that's sufficient to establish the connection and to justify ID as a best explanation.
I appreciate the response. And I think, so just to be clear, and this is going to be, again, this is what philosophers do, right? We're going to dig deep into this, really what seems like a minutiae, but I think is really at the heart of the whole thing. So you offered this response about there being only one known cause for a given effect, intelligence, because I pointed out that in the case of human agency, we have a lot of background knowledge that we don't have in the God case. And you conceded that effectively and said, well, we need this other principle to justify our inference. And you described it as a logical case. And I was just quoting it back at you. So now we've appreciated it's not a logical case.
No. I meant a logical relationship, but it was not a logical necessity.
Not a proof.
Okay.
Right,
and you made that very distinction. Okay. So I'm just saying, yeah, it's a logical relationship.
I agree.
If it's a necessary cause as opposed to a merely sufficient cause, you can retrodict back to the existence of the necessary cause, even if you don't have independent knowledge of its existence. And I would also add, this is not a special case of abduction. It's part of the way abduction works. This is what my PhD thesis was about. And I noticed that there were two different ways to establish existence, to establish the existence case. And one was by showing you have a necessary cause, and the other was by showing that you had consilience of abductions where you have more than one thing pointing to existence. So this isn't some special pleading. It's just a different way of doing it within the same framework of abductive reasoning.
I appreciate that. So the challenge I have here is that in order to illustrate the way in which your different type of abduction was working in the God case, you used an analogy to human agency. And I'm just going to say back to you, we have all the background knowledge in place to secure that inference, even if we're finding hieroglyphics in the Antarctic, because we do know that human beings as a species exist. We know that they have the causal powers to make hieroglyphics. We know that they have the motive to communicate. So it's not really analogous to the God case at all. It's just another example of human agency. And it's these profound disanalogies between the examples.
I think you're missing the essential point of the analogy, James, is that we had no knowledge of the activity of any agent, human or otherwise, functioning in Antarctic before some date certain. Okay, so there was no independent existence case that could be made, and we don't actually know it was a human agent. Maybe the hieroglyphs are describing things that are not terrestrial. I mean, maybe it was an intelligent agent or an extraterrestrial intelligence.
Right.
Similarly, we are conducting currently, or some scientists are, I'm not involved in it, but we are conducting searches for extraterrestrial intelligence. Now, we have no independent existence of such things, but if we find something like the prime number sequence embedded in a radio signal, we will realize that we've got evidence of intelligence, and then we will infer the reality and existence of intelligence in some place from some time, which before the discovery of that evidence, there was no existence. And we didn't do it because we had an independent way of establishing existence, but rather because we found a distinctive hallmark of intelligence. And that mode of reasoning then can be extended correctly to infer an intelligence prior to humans for the origin of life. And then if we engage in a kind of philosophical deliberation, I think, and begin to think about, well, what type of intelligence would explain the ensemble of evidences that I addressed in the book, not only the evidence of design, the information in biology, but also the fine-tuning and the origin of the universe itself, I think the only adequate explanation is a transcendent intelligence. And one other point that's worth making, and I'll get off the stage here because I'm taking a bit too long in reply, but theoretical physics does this type of thing all the time. Without any background knowledge of what quarks may or may not do, we constructed or postulated the notion of a quark because it would have certain types of causal attributes that explain the things that we see. So again, the requirement of independent knowledge of the entity, rather than the requirement that we posit that entity which, if true, would best explain, which is the way the method of inference to the best explanation works, not only when we're talking about theological types of explanations, but profoundly physical ones. This is the way theoretical physics works. We can assess causal powers by assessing our repeated experience of entities that we see at work producing effects, but we can also assess causal powers by evaluating the theoretical attributes that are associated with theoretical entities. And this is done in physics all the time. We couldn't get anywhere in physics without doing this.
So I agree with you about physics, right? And I think that is the best analogy for the sort of inductive inference that you are trying to draw in this case, right? That in some cases, theoretical physicists will hypothesize the existence, something like Higgs boson or something, of a of a particle or a process that we haven't directly observed in order to explain a very well-defined, constrained phenomenon, right? But there's some things to point out that's still quite different to the God inference you're making. Firstly, the precision of the hypothesis related to what it is meant to explain is much, much greater than in your example. Like in principle, God's existence needs to explain everything on some level. So there is no tight connection between the hypothesis you're offering and the thing that it's meant to explain, unlike something like the Higgs boson, which is it's like having physicists, what they're doing is they have a big puzzle, which is our understanding of physics right now. And they identify a missing piece in the puzzle that has a very clearly defined shape and size. And they say, I think there's a piece out there that fits this gap we've got in our puzzle. And the reason I think this is because of the size of the hole and the shape of it. It really has to be that piece. Otherwise, we've got to rethink the whole puzzle, how we put it together. That's kind of an analogy of what they're doing. That's not really analogous to the God hypothesis in this case. I mean, you are really saying you're positing a hypothesis that could literally be called an explanatory hypothesis for any observation. And so that, I think, is not really analogous. But I think the second thing to say is physicists don't stop when they posit the explanation. They go out and try and find the particle. So what they did in the case of the Higgs boson is they tried to get the independent evidence that the thing they hypothesized to explain the phenomena actually existed. And if there's something I want to get across in this discussion, it's the importance of a distinction between offering even a plausible hypothesis that maybe Dr. Meyer has. I'm not convinced, but maybe he does have a plausible hypothesis, and demonstrating that the hypothesis is true, which is a different process. And to demonstrate the distinction between these things and why I think we do need independent evidence rather than just a hypothesis that could potentially, were it true, explain what we see. I want to quote from a philosopher who Dr. Meyer uses in his work, who came up with this idea of reductive causal analysis, Michael Scriven. And he was very worried about the misapplication of this very abductive inference process that we've been talking about. And he said, careless use of such arguments produces ad hoc explanations. We have to show that 1, the cause was in fact present. 2, independent evidence supports the claim that it can produce the effect. And 3, no other such causes were present. I.e., he, and I agree with him, lots of other philosophers agree, that merely positing a hypothesis that were it true would explain a phenomenon is very different from demonstrating that your hypothesis is true. And for that requires independent evidence, which it doesn't seem to me that we have.
Let me chime in, because I love Michael Scriven, and he was a big part of the most important chapter of my PhD thesis, which was the third.
Which I read.
Yes, well, there we go. That's why we're having such a good discussion. This is fantastic. This is a very high level conversation, so no question. I didn't know which direction this would go, so fantastic. So I'm well aware of Scriven. Scriven also makes the same point I do, that in the case where you have only one known cause, you are in a position to make a strong abductive inference to existence, even if you don't have independent evidence. But the way we get independent evidence is awfully just as, well, let me do the points in order. I'm gonna go back. You pointed out that what the physicists are doing is they're positing an entity with particular attributes, which, if true, would explain the phenomena in question. And they often will posit more than one attribute associated with the entity. In other words, they're positing an entity that has the right kind of causal profile to explain the effects or the evidence that we have on hand. And that's exactly what I'm doing in this book. I'm positing 3 causal attributes that I think are necessary to explain the ensemble or the suite of evidences that we have about biological, physical, and cosmological origins. I'm positing intelligence, therefore mind. I'm positing an intelligence that is active in the creation after the beginning, because some of the evidence of design that we have arises long after the beginning. And I'm positing an agent that has that is also in some way transcendent or separate from the universe in such a way that the agent could act to bring the universe and its finely tuned structure into existence in the first place. Now, there's no difference in principle. This is what's called a transdictive inference, where you're moving from what you can see to something that can't be seen in order to explain the observables. This is what's done in physics all the time, whether we're talking about forces or fields or Higgs bosons or quarks, etc. Now, the way you provide additional evidence in physics is true. You do go out and you try to find additional evidence in support of the thesis, but you don't do it by looking at the boson or holding the field. You do it by looking at other things that you think would also result from the existence of that same thing. In other words, the additional evidence is equally indirect and abductive. And so this is what's called a consilience of abductions, where you have multiple pieces of evidence that can be explained simply by the same hypothesis. And that is exactly the nature of the case that I'm making for theism, that it has broad explanatory power across a range of phenomena. Yes, we're reasoning indirectly from the observables to the unobservable, but then again, that's exactly what's done in historical biology, archaeology, sometimes medicine, definitely in geology, and always in theoretical physics. So I don't think there is an in-principle difference. And in fact, what I've done is I've added different types of evidence to the case. I would say one other thing is that within the program of research that's being conducted by scientists who hold to the theory of intelligent design, there's a general movement now to supplement the first arguments for intelligent design that were made in books like Darwin's Black Box by Michael Behe, or My Signature in the Cell, or Doug Axe's work, to using intelligent design as a heuristic to make further discoveries. And to say, look, if life were designed by an intelligent agent, if it was the product of a top-down rather than bottom-up Darwinian process, there are certain types of things we would have a greater likelihood of seeing if life were designed in that way. And so what a number of our scientists are doing is using design to make predictions and to go out and see if they find evidence of those, for example, computer design patterns or function in the hidden function in the so-called junk DNA, or any number of predictions that ID proponents have made that are discriminating predictions vis-a-vis materialist chemical or biological evolutionary theorists. And that's another way to provide additional support. And that's taking place in real time. One of our scientists in Germany predicted the existence of a very specific kind of computer design pattern for the storage of information, and has actually found overlapping genes, which is a storage density technology in all 6 reading reference frames in the bacterial genome. Now, that's something that was, when he started trying to get the papers published, the mainstream journals wouldn't take it, not because he was arguing that this was evidence for intelligent design, but because it was so dramatically unexpected on a Darwinian model. So there are many ways to add to the case that I'm making, and I think research that's ongoing on the theory of intelligent design is adding additional sources of information. So I accept your point that, yeah, when you posit something because of its explanatory power, then you want to see if it explains other things or can lead to discovery of new things that would be unexpected on contrary models, and that's happening.
James, you still with us?
I'm still here. I'm just listening, and I know that you want to get to questions at a certain point. So
no,
I guess the only thing I want to say in response to that. Go ahead.
No, I'm happy to keep the conversation going. Interestingly, the questions that have come through have been more or less on this area of conversation that you've had anyway, which seems to be about the relationship between information and communication, and the different types of information and how we might consider them to be intelligently designed or not. So a gentleman called Sean O'Hara, who I think you might know, has posited a couple of questions on that, drawing out the distinction between different information sources and how we can, he says the distinctions would be that hieroglyphs and radio signals are forms of communication. Specifically, this is distinct from RNA, which is a protein structure. So there's this interesting line of thinking, Steve, about distinguishing the structures of DNA from their messaging capabilities, the information capacity of these things. I wonder, James has disappeared again, so I'm hoping
No,
he's-
I'm still here. I'm
Oh.
just trying to keep everything stable. When we've all got
Good.
a video on, it seems to be a little
Lovely.
bit.
Yeah, me too. Me too.
Yeah.
Good work. Yeah,
Yeah.
we're having to have this high level discussion and manage the tech at the same time. It's more than you should ask any two philosophers, I think.
Yeah.
Let me weigh in on this. There was a huge section in my book. I'll hold it just for signature in the cell. Chapter 4 addresses this whole question of what type of information do we have in DNA? And we can give a characterization. There's a very important analytical cut. There's multiple ways that people have tried to define information, but there's a basic analytical cut that's relevant here. And that's between what's known as Shannon information, which is a measure of the reduction of uncertainty or the improbability of a given state of affairs over among a larger set of possibilities. And communication theory uses information in the Shannon sense to quantify the information carrying capacity of, for example, an information channel, or a carrying capacity of a channel, or the carrying capacity of a sequence or a symbol string. But Shannon and Weaver and the founders of information theory made clear that they did not, their analytical apparatus did not make possible a distinction between functional information or meaningful information on the one hand, and mere information carrying capacity on the other. In other words, you could measure the improbability of a string without knowing whether or not the string was meaningful or functional. So the kind of information that justifies a design inference in my argument, in the way I argue the case, is not mere Shannon information. It's Shannon information plus meaning or plus function. And that is, and those joint properties of what we call small probability and functional specification, or specification that is actually a broader category in which function is a subset. Small probabilities sequences that are also specified, and there's a technical way of defining that, but we can think of it as meaning or function for rough and ready discussion purposes. Those two things in conjunction justify design inference. In all cases where we know the origin of informational sequences that are both improbable and highly specified by reference to independent set of functional requirements, those types of sequences are always the product of intelligent design. Now, what we have in DNA and RNA are sequence-specific arrangements of bases or nucleotide bases that are performing an overall and very important function, which is building the proteins that make cells work. So that what the closest analog in terms of technology would be something like our CAD/CAM, computer-assisted design and manufacture. But the argument here is not merely analogical. It's identifying a specific effect, namely specified or functional information that has, in our experience, one and only one known source or cause, and that being intelligence. So we very carefully define the type of effect under consideration. In philosophy of science language, the explanandum is not just information in some unspecified or undefined way, but rather the very type of information that in our experience only arises from a mind.
Can I ask a question about that? Because it seems to me that this identification of a particular type of, quotes, information as being characteristically produced by a mind is really central to this argument. And I guess I worry about it on a number of levels. Firstly, when you say this sort of information is characteristically or only ever been seen to be produced by a mind, what you really mean is by human beings, don't you? Like that's what we've actually seen. Our actual evidence base is purely human minds creating radio signals, computer codes, hieroglyphics, etc.
Correct, but it is our mental capabilities that are responsible for the production. It's not that we have two arms and two legs and a couple of ears in the right place. Yeah.
But these are the sorts of things that in our uniform and repeated experience always arise from human beings, right? That's a true statement.
True, but it is the attribute of mind that humans possess that is the most relevant causal element or actor in that connection.
So that's
and
a positive,
therefore it makes
right? So I'm not sure about that bit, right? That's the difference. So I'm just making a distinction because it seems to me the immediate abductive inference you would most directly draw is if in our uniform and repeated experience, computer programs, hieroglyphic inscriptions, radio signals, etc., are always the product of human beings, we might be tempted to say, well, so with DNA, that must be made by human beings. Now that
except we have independent knowledge that DNA and simpler forms of life long pre-existed us. So we have to eliminate from consideration the human designer hypothesis. And this is where I think one of the things that characterizes a lot of skepticism or skeptical arguments about this is that the attempt to imply rules that are effective in context and make them universal to cut off other forms of relevant and forms of reasoning that are obvious. If it's not a human being, then we want to extend that inference to the best explanation mode of reasoning and say, well, what other types of designing agents might be relevant then to explain this distinctive artifact of mind? And maybe it's a space alien. And a lot of people have proposed that. Actually, Dawkins regrets to have proposed it. Francis Crick proposed it with some seriousness. But then there's a problem with the space alien explanation in that that entity would have had to have evolved somewhere in the cosmos, starting from some simpler organism, in which case you right back to the problem of the origin of information in the first place. And clearly no space alien is capable of explaining the origin of the universe or the fine-tuning of the universe, which are necessary conditions of its existence. So it's not as good an overall explanation as the God hypothesis. That's kind of the argument of the book.
I understand.
Or one of them. Yeah.
And I guess the worry I have about it is, so it seems like the most direct and obvious inference we would draw from the form of argument you make is that if human beings are the result of these things that we see that are designed, the cause of the things that we see that we are designed, and if we are entitled to reason back to the thing that we see most frequently as the cause of the effects that we observe, then we would most directly reason back to human agency, but that leads to an absurd conclusion, as you've pointed out, because we know human beings can't possibly be the result of the cause of DNA. But that might point to a problem with the structure of the inference, right? When our direct inference has an absurd conclusion, we don't usually say, okay, well, we need to rescue our inference by expanding the category of causal agents from just human beings, which is what we actually observe, to intelligence in general. We say, oh, maybe I've done an illegitimate inference here. Maybe it's just not legitimate.
I don't think I wouldn't concede that it is an absurd conclusion, because it is, after all, it is self-conscious awareness and the power of deliberation that allows us to produce information.
It was the human being.
That capability may exist in humans, or it may exist only in humans, but it may exist in other entities as well. And so that's simply broadening the range of possible explanatory hypotheses under consideration. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. That's inherent to the method of multiple competing hypotheses or inference to the best explanation.
Right. But
it's our minds, not our fingernails, or our toes, or our teeth that are responsible for our ability to generate information. And if we weren't on the scene, then it's quite logical to say, well, maybe another type of mind was responsible.
So, right, we resist the immediate outcome.
And we shouldn't box ourselves in by applying a rule and saying, well, the inference has to look exactly like this or that. This is the kind of fallacy that I think happens with the demarcation argument in science. Well, science always has these characteristics. I think we should use good reasoning and use the tools, whatever tools help us get to the conclusion. And if it's not an intelligent, if the evidence in biology is pointing to a mind, and I mean, we can make this excessively abstract. What I loved about the Dawkins tweet last week was he said he's knocked sideways, and he posted the animation of this exquisite information processing system that is generating new DNA in our cells at multiple times a second. And I think it's, again, worth underscoring that there are not even plausible naturalistic explanations for the chemical origin of life. And so, in a way, I would characterize the attempt to resist the design argument here as a bit of nibbling around the edges, rather than really taking on the essential explanatory task of, if not an intelligent agent, then what does account for the origin of this exquisite informational storage, transmission, and processing system that we see inside living cells. In other words, I'm not willing to bear an unreasonable burden of proof in this. I think the naturalist, the materialist, the atheist needs to do more than try to, logic shop as a way of resisting the conclusion and actually formulate a better explanation.
Well, I mean, I don't think that I'm asking for an unreasonable burden of proof. My worry is that you are making an illegitimate, unjustified abductive inference. And if that's the case, your argument doesn't have any explanatory force. So, I mean, unless we can overcome the major disanalogies between successful abductive inferences and the one that you want to make, I don't really think there's a case to answer. But
I would say that the things that are disanalogous are things that are irrelevant to the causal attributes that humans possess. It's our minds. Yes, if we posit God as an intelligent agent, or if we posit a space alien as an intelligent agent, a hypothesis I don't favor, there may be differences in the way in which that intelligence is embodied or not, but it is intelligence or mind which is the relevant property that those prospective hypotheses would possess that allow the explanation of the information. It's our minds that generate the information. It's not the things that make us distinctively human as opposed to some other possible form of intelligence. So I don't think that's illegitimate. We're inferring to a mind of some kind. In the first two books, I left that unspecified. Yeah. But in this book, I'm pressing the point that a certain type of mind would do the best job of explaining the overall evidence we have of both design in life, the cosmos, and the origin of the universe itself, none of which are explained on basic naturalism.
I think, I just disagree with the idea that, for instance, the fact that we are embodied agents is irrelevant to our causal powers. In our uniform and repeated experience, all agents are material. All causal agents are material, right? So we have no experience whatsoever of disembodied intelligences performing any causal actions whatsoever. In fact, I'm not even sure that is a logically coherent concept. So I think that to say that the relevant causal attribute of human beings is mind simpliciter is an abstract concept. An abstract concept is causally non-efficacious. So I don't see how you think it's with our bodies that we do all these things. We make, to use your examples, radio signals and computer codes and hieroglyphics through material interaction with the natural world. So our uniform and repeated experience tells us that all causal outcomes are the result, all causal outcomes that are a result of intelligent agency are the result of embodied agents taking material action. And you want to infer
the very spirited argument that you're prosecuting. Yeah, well, sorry to interrupt. Yeah, the very spirited argument that you're prosecuting right now in our conversation was not initiated in your arms or your legs or your fingernails or even just the neurochemistry of your brain. I don't think you'd want to reduce the activity of your mind to the neurochemistry of your brain. It was initiated in the mind. The communication started in the mind. So if you go back to a causal singularity where the first cause of your communication, it starts with James. It doesn't start with cells, okay? It starts with you. And I think one of the things that often results from the line of argument that you're pursuing is that materialists have to, in the end, deconstruct their own personhood and mind in order to maintain the case for the materialistic viewpoint that they're defending. I want to say that mind is something that is, I'm a mind-body dualist, and I think you can make a very strong case for that. So, I think mind is, and so I'm prepared to defend that. But I think the materialist equally has to be prepared to defend the reduction of mind to matter. And I think that results in absurdities that philosophically that I think also point in a decidedly theistic direction.
I think that's a really good point to highlight for our audience, because I think that a lot of the force of the inference you're drawing to agency on the part of God actually relies on a prior metaphysical assumption, which is mind-body dualism. And I reject mind-body dualism. I'm a thoroughgoing naturalist, right? I think mind and brain are essentially the same thing. And so because of that, you positing a disembodied intelligent agent to explain things which you think are similar to the actions of embodied physical agents like ourselves is a non-starter, because I don't share your dualism. But I think that this is a really important point for people. I think the convincingness of the argument that Dr. Meyer promotes in his book might well depend on one's prior metaphysical assumptions and actually whether you already believe in God or not. And I think Dr. Meyer has spoken and written sometimes about how you were not convinced of God's existence by these arguments you're presenting, but by presuppositional considerations and other philosophical arguments. And I think that if you already believe in God, and you have God as part of the causal repertoire of the universe, then obviously appealing to God as one cause among many that could have done certain things is more plausible than it will be for the naturalist who comes to it saying, I don't actually think God exists. So show me God exists before you appeal to God as a causal agent. And
I'm not arguing based on a presupposition of God's existence. I'm arguing for the God hypothesis and indeed intelligent design on the basis of the possible existence of God, or the possible existence of mind as something that is a causal actor. And I've written an essay about this, and I'll post it in response to the discussion here, as for further consideration. But I've argued that my argument does not depend on mind-body dualism. Rather, it only depends on a pre-theoretic awareness of the causal attributes that we ourselves have as minds, as self-conscious agents. We have direct introspective awareness of our minds as conscious beings. And it is an entity that has something like those powers that we know we have by such direct introspective awareness that is responsible for the production of information. And there's one of the early information theorists who applied information theory and information theoretic concepts to the analysis of molecular biology, to DNA and RNA, said that the creation of information is habitually associated with conscious activity. And I think it's conscious deliberative activity, which is the explanation for the origin of information. And I'm simply open, I'm not presupposing, but I'm open to the possibility that capability could exist in other agents other than human beings. And in fact, given that we weren't around 3.85 billion years ago when the first life arose out of the whatever it was, prebiotic soup or otherwise, I think we have to be open to that as a possible explanatory hypothesis. Then, having proposed it, I show as a possible hypothesis, not presupposing that it must exist, I show that it has superior explanatory power with respect to the phenomena of interest.
Thank you. Now, we are nearly running out of time, and we've had a sudden flurry of questions arrive like buses all at once. And I did just want to run a couple of these past the two of you.
Should we do some quick hits? Yes or no's? Do philosophers do yes or no's? James, I don't know if that was part of your training.
We try and resist it, but I'm happy to on this occasion.
Go for it, guys. The first question, I suppose, is more about scientific method. But the question is addressed to you, Steve, but I think you can both tackle this, is there anything you think that could possibly falsify your God hypothesis? Is the God hypothesis falsifiable? And that, of course, has implications, doesn't it?
Well, I don't think hypotheses in science, let alone in metaphysics. I'm quite happy to characterize the argument for God that I make in the book as a metaphysical hypothesis, where I think the inference to design simpliciter is probably more aptly characterized as an historical scientific hypothesis. I'm not big on demarcation. I think those lines are often blurred, and they certainly are in this case. But I think the testing of hypotheses is very rarely definitively accomplished by a single predictive outcome that either confirms or disconfirms in the way that Karl Popper formulated his notion of falsification. And I think most philosophers of science now agree with that, for the simple reason that it's too easy to invent ad hoc hypotheses that explain, or auxiliary hypotheses that can be quite legitimate, that can explain why a prediction of a given model didn't come true, or a given experiment didn't, why the prediction of a given experiment didn't manifest itself as the experimenter might have been suggesting. And so typically we assess hypotheses, both in science and metaphysics, by reference to their overall explanatory power vis-a-vis competing hypotheses. And I've come to the conclusion that theism provides the best overall explanation of these key scientific facts. And in a larger sense, the key facts of our experience because of its overall superior explanatory power. If I thought, not felt, but thought that naturalism or pantheism or deism or a space alien designer conjoined with a naturalistic naturalism better explain the overall ensemble of things that I think are crucial to explain to make sense of our experience, I would be a deist or a pantheist or a space alien designer proponent, a panspermist or whatever. But so I'm quite open to, I mean, I think I explained in the book that I had a rather tortuous conversion experience, first to theism and to Christianity. And that was a result of weighing these various considerations and trying to make sense of experience in the way a philosopher would. And so I think all such thinking is always provisional because we are in the human condition. We do not have the ultimate God's eye view. So my thinking is provisional but settled. I'm comfortable in the conclusion that I've drawn. I think that the case for theism is very strong indeed, and so I don't accept the standard of strict falsification as the only way to evaluate either a metaphysical or scientific hypothesis. It doesn't really work. Popper's ideas have not fared well in the philosophy of science.
Okay, thank you. James, anything to add on that? James?
I think what Dr. Meyer says was no, but it doesn't matter that insofar as it's not necessary to have a falsifiable theory to have a good.
Ooh. James is having problems. Come back. James.
Theory. But you do need to have a theory that's specific for it and what would be evidence against it. And one of my concerns is that I'm not sure that it is that specific. Am I gone?
We're back into Dalek land, folks. Sorry, James, you're breaking up and you're cracking me up.
About that, I don't know what happened. It was working for me. Is it working now?
I think he was making the point that well, we needn't subscribe to falsification as the end-all and be-all of testing or evaluation. It is important to be able to specify evidence that would count against your theory. And I am prepared to do that. For example, yes. Since I'm making a strong abductive inference to intelligent design as the best explanation, I couldn't possibly hold that view if there was some other demonstrated explanation for the origin of large amounts of specified or functional biological information. At best, I could say then design was a possible explanation. I'd have to subscribe to a much weaker form of the hypothesis than I'm advancing. And if there was a compelling example of the spontaneous origin of information in a biological context, given Occam's razor, I'd probably have to go with a naturalistic chemical evolutionary theory as a better overall explanation. So I am prepared to specify, but I do think that it's a weighing of preponderance of evidence that leads people to conclusions. It's not the silver bullet, and often that can lead to these kind of gotcha questions. Well, what would falsify your theory? Well, we've been asking the Darwinists that for 150 years now, and one point I didn't get to make, James, just in response to your point number 3 in your opening statement, was that we're quite prepared to accept and do accept microevolution, but or limitations within or evolution within the limited framework of within the limited endowments of genetic information that are inherent in, say, different groups within the higher taxonomic categories. But one of the key things that leading evolutionary biologists are now saying, and I attended this conference at the Royal Society event in 2016, is that the mutation selection mechanism and other complementary evolutionary mechanisms are doing a good job of explaining the the small-scale modification, the survival of the fittest, not the arrival of the fittest. They do a good job of explaining minor modifications and variations, but not major innovations in the history of life. And even leading evolutionary biologists are now not only conceding that, but looking for some new mechanisms that could close that gap. So I don't think it's really the case that we have this kind of all-encompassing evolutionary naturalistic account of things that should give us a predilection, or should say we should be predisposed to naturalistic explanations in all cases. I don't think that's the case.
Thank you, Steve. Now we are out of time. There was one last question as a sort of bonus.
Yeah, you should give James, he got kind of cut off. In fairness, you should give him a chance to field this last one. I'm sorry, I kind of jumped in because he was having trouble with the feed.
All right, James, do you want to add to that? Sorry. I should have given you a chance, shouldn't I? I think James is struggling again. He's cut off.
Or maybe just let him take the last question. That sounds great.
James, can you hear me all right?
Yeah, I can.
Okay, good. No, there was a question from a gentleman called Roger who said, if the cosmos is the result of intelligent design, how does one explain the appalling results? An intelligent designer might judge human free will, including wickedness, to be a priority, but how does one account for natural evils such as tsunamis, and asteroid strikes, the cruelty of predatory animals, infect, blah blah blah. You know, the whole range.
Yeah, no, I got it. Yeah, no, exactly.
So,
no, there's two classes of evil, and theists require two different types of defense. There's the evil that is the direct response of human choice. I find the free will defense there entirely compelling. The idea that God would have made a lesser entity if we had been compelled to always obey, respond in love, etc., and that the condition of deep relationship and love, a condition of deep relationship and love is free will. And so by creating agents with free will, God was obviously taking a chance, and humans have fallen. The natural evil is a more difficult thing to explain from I would say, a non-religious perspective of intelligent design. But I'm not only a design theorist, I also am a biblical Christian. And I think if, from the standpoint of biblical theology, we should expect to see two things in nature, not one. One is evidence of aboriginal design that is good and elegant, but also evidence of subsequent decay. And I think we do see both those things. And so for me, as a biblical design theorist, or a design theorist who holds a biblical theology of nature, I see exactly what I would expect to see in nature. I have a long footnote about this at the end of chapter 14 in the book for people who are taking notes on their scorecards at home, and discuss one thing that's quite intriguing, which is something we've learned in the study of virulence in both bacteria and viruses. Clear examples in many cases of natural evil, things that harm us. The virulent strains of bacteria and viri are invariably the consequence of a loss of aboriginal information that can be actually traced to mutations. One colleague of mine, a microbiologist, Scott Minnick, who's an expert on the plague bacterium, has done a kind of natural history of the plague, showing that 4 separate mutations that arose over time turned an entirely benevolent form of a bacterium for which we had an innate immune response into something that was a great killer. So I think the worldview I hold anticipates both original design and powerful evidence of that, which I think we do see, but also evidence of decay. And interestingly, the very thing that makes life possible, information, in the inverse, in its diminution, is the thing that is responsible for much of the natural evil we see in the world, the loss of information or its degradation.
Thank you, Steve. We are now at the end, but I was hoping to address that to James, because
I'm sorry.
No, it's all right. No, it was a very good answer. But the reason why I wanted to address it to James was I wonder whether part of the objection to the very idea of design in the universe comes from this sensitivity to suffering and evil, and whether it actually influences the way we approach these things.
So I think the challenge for the argument, as Dr. Meyer presents it, is that in order to make the sort of inference he wants to make, he needs to specify an agent, so in this case, God, specify some intention that he thinks God would have, and ideally give us some independent reasons to think God would have that intention, because otherwise you're just sort of helping yourself to whatever you need to make the argument work, right? If there's no constraints on what intentions God could have, then the hypothesis can take any shape, regardless of what we see. So hopefully you've got some constraints on the sorts of desires that God would have. And then you say, well, okay, if there's a God, and if God has these desires, then God, acting rationally, would do X, Y, and Z to bring about these desires. Do we see X, Y, and Z? And then we would look at the universe and see whether it fits. And the worry I have about the sorts of responses that Dr. Meyer has been giving here is that they require you to add, I think in an ad hoc manner, lots of considerations to our concept of God that weren't necessarily there at the beginning. So we started with the idea of an all-powerful transcendent agent who is all good and wants life. And then we see, oh, there's a lot of suffering. Well, how can we fix that? That's a problem, because if God is all good, then we shouldn't have this sort of suffering. Well, he also...
Oh, no. Come back. James, I think we're going to draw this to an end. I think probably Steve would answer that by saying, actually, those answers are given to you in the biblical account of the world and humanity. So we do actually have those constraints. But I think we're going to have to finish now. And Josh is back.
Something we hadn't already seen.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, dude. Thank you both, Steve and James, for your participation. It's been wonderful, and I'd like to do this again very soon.
Yeah,
I'd like to thank my interlocutor. Wonderful discussion. All the key issues, I think, were raised at a deep level of epistemology, which is where these things do get considered and decided. So, and then thank you all for hosting, of course, Kevin and Joshua. And sorry for the slight difficulties with the feed, but we did pretty well, better than I expected. So that
yeah.
We are in freedom places. Thank you.
Before I pass over to Josh, just an apology to any of you who don't feel we answered your questions. In the end, I'm afraid the clock was against us, but thank you both very much. It's been an absolute delight to have you with us. Josh.
I do wonder, gentlemen, if this is the genesis of a point counterpoint book. I would love to see some of these points on paper. But thank you to all of our audience. I know I can't see you, but I believe you've been good sports in bearing with us through our technical mishaps throughout this session. So thank you. Thank you to Dr. Meyer. We so appreciate you taking the time to introduce your new book and these stimulating ideas. If you want to find out more about Dr. Meyer and the Discovery Institute, he has a website, and also the Discovery Institute do a podcast called ID the Future. You can look that up. You can also find more from Dr. James Croft at the Ethical Society of St. Louis. That's ethicalstl.org. And he has a newsletter, Being Human, so you can follow his writing there. He's also on Twitter. And thank you, Dr. Croft, for joining us, for being such a good sport as well. I know you've read extensively in preparation for this, and perhaps at some point it'll be good to hear from you, perhaps on the topic of your own doctoral research, intellectual autonomy. That would be fun to prize open.
Anytime you want, Josh. You can become like the fourth person ever to talk about my doctoral discipline.
Thank you, everyone, for being with us.